business owners likely will have only one shot to sell a business. Most don't understand what drives value and how buyers look at a business. Until now. Welcome to the How to Sell a Business podcast, where every week we talk to the subject matter experts, advisors, and those around the deal table about how to sell at maximum value. Every business will go to sell one day. It's only a matter of when. We're glad you're here. The podcast starts now.
Did you ever think about your data? And as a seller, that's one of the most important pieces of a sale is your information. And believe it or not, there's a difference between information and data. And today I had an opportunity to talk to Mike Butler. And Mike Butler is a data and analytics executive. He works for a local company here called CSpring. And I met the chief of staff, Emma Myers, and we were talking about just data. I was listening to her talk, and it kept on making me think, my gosh, there's so much more to data that I think sellers as well as buyers are overlooking. Everybody's talking about financials and making the deal work, but not as many people are talking about, what does this deal look like 6, 12, 18 months from now when we assimilate that company in? So Mike, oh my gosh, he has been, like I said, he's the chief data officer for CSpring. He's worked in the financial services industry as a CTO. He is just a wealth of knowledge, and I'll have all of his information and contact information in the show notes. But I can tell you, out of this year's podcast, this is one of the top ones, and so I hope you enjoy my conversation with Mike Butler of CSpring. Well, welcome to the show, Mike.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad to have you. And before you came on, I was giving the audience an overview of you and CSpring, but I'm not certain I really did it justice. So can you just talk at the high level, and then we'll jump into some questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So CSpring is a data consulting firm headquartered in Carmel, Indiana. It's been around since 1996 under different names, but we're working with both public and private sector clients. Our customers usually come to us because they want to do something around decision making. They want to do something around automation, something in that where also we deliver analytics solutions then to help them save time, money, and any frustration on that part.
I get you. And therein lies the point of our conversation, because getting that data from point A to point B in a business sale is, I'm not really certain everyone understands just the risk associated with that is such a huge part of the value that you're buying. I think I'm trying to figure out whether or not it's more important, if people are more important or the data is more important, so we can get into that, but I'm going to lead off with an excerpt from the periodical Chief Executive. So it reads, with technology playing such a critical role in organizations' success and failure, one might think IT would be of chief concern for M&A due diligence, but it turns out that the opposite is true. So this survey in January, conducted by Chief Executive and Elliott Davis, found that only 9% believe that the acquisition target's tech capabilities is a critical driver of M&A, while 21% said technology had little to do with deal making. And I find it astounding. But you're in it. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so the business side of me is like, yeah, it shouldn't have a material impact, but the reality is like there's so much about it that can create a problem in the deal. So a really good example would be if the company that you're buying has had a cyber breach and they don't know about it, and you're buying something for its brand or you're buying something for its reputation or something like that, you could take on that business, realize they've had a cyber breach, and maybe it's in your policy, you have to tell people that, and all of a sudden you're releasing that as your company, not the company you just bought. And so it's an interesting problem that shows up, but the quote makes sense. I've done a number of these, and usually technology's job is to try to figure out how to find a way. And then there's just situations where it's complicated. And I do think it's something you want to keep in mind in your due diligence process and try to figure it out.
Yeah. And I follow a little bit on the cyber side, but on the data side, I find it hard to believe that people aren't like, that is such an important component of what you're buying, is especially if it's, a synergistic buy where you have one party that's buying either market share or, whatever the synergy is. I would think that they would be all over, data integrity and how are we going to get it from point A to point B?
Yeah. And so like if you're buying a company and sometimes you're buying a customer list or you're expanding into a market or something like that. I was reading about, JP Chase that just bought, a company that had falsified about 70% of the data they had bought in this acquisition. And they were it was basically a firm that had a bunch of marketing capabilities. They were trying to attract, a younger generation. And so the challenge is because they didn't really do their due diligence up front. They didn't realize that most of what they were buying was actually junk. And so they way overpaid for it.
So, I'm certain either there was some sort of vehicle to, I'm certain there was some sort of recourse, but that leads to the question. How do you, if I'm a buyer and I'm walking in, if I'm a buyer, I want to know about the data. If I'm a seller, I'm like, yeah, you know what? Why don't we wait a little bit until we're further down the road? But how do you bridge that gap? Because I have to assume that's a real, I understand both sides, but how can you give, I guess the question is, how do you provide some sort of assurance on data integrity from the sell side and give enough information that the buyer is willing to take the next step and move toward closing the deal? Yeah.
That's a really hard one because like every organization is a little different how they interpret quality, how they interpret what they need to do. So from a buyer perspective, it's always good to know the data inventories that are out there, what you're really buying, challenge the quality of what you're buying. I think is really important. From a seller perspective, I think you really do have to be ready to address some of these challenges. So, before you might have just said, yeah, I'm just going to sell. It's not really going to matter. But these days it really does matter. Sometimes people are buying you for those digital assets more than anything. And those digital assets, that's data, it's information, it's things like that. So you do have to be ready to, I usually tell people, and part of the process is to create an inventory of what's out there, an inventory of what's a part of the sale. And then essentially going through and coming up with a way you're going to evaluate that. And so like the example of JP Chase, they obviously didn't evaluate the quality of the data. And I think it's a really good example of, as the buyer, you want to make sure you've got enough levers in place that you can try to figure out like what's the value of what you're buying, and what are you going to be able to do with it? I had a conversation with a CPA the other day about valuation of data within your organization. Right. And it is a little difficult. It's it's different if you're a data company where, if you're like Google, that's what you are, versus a company where data is more of a byproduct of what you're doing and you're going to use it for some kind of monetization effort. And it's difficult. It's a hard process.
So you and I keep talking about data, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself. Let's define what data is in this world.
Yeah. So there's I like to say there's data and there's information. So data is just raw stuff. It's just things you've measured, information about your clients, stuff that's stored in applications. Could be stuff that's stored in your Google Sheets or your OneDrive, or it doesn't matter what it is. But data is just everything associated with that. And it's also, people tend to think of it as digital. It's also all your paper records and things like that. It's everything you've got. Information tends to be something that we've done with that data, where we've created a report or we've created analysis or we've, done something. So financial reports are a really good example. The raw transactions in your ledger, that's just data. And then when we take those transactions, we roll them up and we create like a P&L statement or something like that. That's information. We can now make some decisions from it and do something with it.
So is the value in the data or the value in the information?
It's in the data because it flows from left to right. It starts with data.
Okay.
And then we flow into information from there.
I get it. So I know you've been part of a number of acquisitions, and that's what, I was so fortunate that Emma had brought us together. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is, what are the challenges associated with trying to get the data at the time of sale. There's so much going on. How do you do that? I can tell you when we merged a company into our practice, and this is 15 years ago, and we still are getting haunted by some of the idiot moves we made, as it related to the data and and whose database won, whose process won, whose. Yep. So I guess that's what I wanted to talk to you about is what are some of the challenges that you see, as part of a sale?
Yeah, there's a few. I'll hit a couple. There's a lot. Well, the one you just talked about is actually like my number one is when you're involved in a sale and if it's a merger of equals and you're trying to decide, okay, whose system, whose process, who's what, that making those decisions and making explicitly and knowing like the pros and cons of what you're going to do. Yeah. A lot of times people buy, like I would run into these situations where you would buy a company and we'd say, oh, they have a better CRM. Let's just move to theirs. Well, the problem with that is you have processes in place within your organization of how you're using your existing CRM. And unless there was a plan to already move to that CRM and you're just going to use that to jumpstart, it's usually a bad idea to take in processes and technology from a company you're acquiring and try to force fit your current process on it. It's usually better to run an integration or a digital transformation project or something like that. Usually you do a project later to do some of that. Anyway, so that first like inventory, making those decisions, knowing the implications of the decision, that's my old enterprise architecture days. Those are the things that we would have to model out. And then you get these other challenges that start to occur. So let's say you make those decisions. Well, now you have some other problems. I've been a part of acquisitions where we actually made the assumption that everything was digital form, and it wasn't. It was in paper formats. There are companies, and there's several in Indy. They can do transformations of data from paper to digital. But guess what? It costs per page, per word, for things like that. So there's a huge cost component that shows up if you've got things that aren't. The second thing that I think is really complicated is how you merge that data. So at this point, we make the assumption that let's say we've got it. We know we're going to move like from one, I don't know, let's say we have Salesforce and we're going to move it into Microsoft Dynamics. Maybe that's what you're using. The problem you run into is how are you even going to do that? Like, is it even possible? What was the quality of the data that was tracked in the acquirers or in the acquired system? And it's a big process. I usually tell people you're probably not going to do it with all. Some of that data you can just archive. There's some techniques for that. You can archive that data, use it later if you want. Some of that data you have to get immediately into your systems, like on day 1 or day 5 or whatever that turns into. And then the last thing, and there's so many, but these are like the ones I wanted to talk through. The last thing that a lot of people don't think about is sometimes the size of the data or the application or something like that. There either aren't interfaces into it, the data is so big or something like that, it's very difficult, timely to move it. So you can't actually get it done in day 1 or something like that. It might take a week to just move the data around to get it into a state where you can load it. And then there are systems that don't. You have to model all this out, and we used to do mock runs with this stuff where we'd test everything and make sure we could actually do it in the speed we thought we could do it. But you have to model through all that, and you have to figure out, okay, how am I going to load this data? Can I move it in the time? What's the business need? And there's a number of things you have to do. So I guess the real answer is there's a lot of challenges that show up when you're trying to move data around.
Well, I say the funny thing, but it's really not funny, and we paid the tuition on it, is everybody just assumes, all right, you have let's just say databases. You have two databases, you export all your data, you put it into Excel, you look for duplicates or whatever, you do some merging, and then whosever database you're going to go with, you just re-upload it. And I can tell you from experience, that absolutely does not work. And the funny thing is and I hope you can talk about how to help people find people like you to do this. Because we did pretty good due diligence on who, we were getting the same information from multiple people, but at the end of the day, this was not the way to handle the merging of data. So I'm jumping around here, but can you talk a little bit about how to find people like you? And yeah, that's it. How to find people like you to do this kind of work, and what is the process associated with doing it? Yeah.
The easiest. So, when I was, consultant now, but on the other side of the house, I used to go hire consulting firms. A lot of times the companies, like your applications that you want to merge into, they have experts within those companies. You can call them and you can say, here's what I'm working on. Do you have someone that I can work with that can help me with how I would move data? The larger problem, and you actually hit it, is you have to figure out how to get data out of the system. You then have to gap the differences between how, maybe that system was tracking data with the system you want to merge into. We then have to build, and usually this is programmatic. You have to build a map. Essentially, I'm going to move this field, has to become these two fields in this new system. You write that program, you then test and go through that process. And then there's a lot of, you can do a lot of automated validation, but the reality is people have to look at it at some point. And it turns out you usually want the people from the system that you're acquiring to look at it. And then from there, you do the load. If there's a way to load it. Sometimes you have to there's three methods. It's database to database, right? Like you said, right. Pull it out, shove it in Excel, do some stuff, shove it back up into another database. Sometimes you can get data out, but there's no real good interface to get it in. You might have a programmatic interface or something like that. And then the last one is, you just have to do it manually, right? And there's some tools for that. But the way I used to find people was, my vendors, I'd reach out to companies like CSpring and say, hey, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. You know how to do this. Have you done this before? There's this whole field of just data engineering that deals with this. I got good at it at the last place I was at, because I had spent so much time managing internally all the applications and systems and trying to get all the data together, that when we would buy companies, we had the tooling to go out and deal with some of that kind of stuff.
And how much time did it take? Because I know and I know it's a loaded question, but I know everybody is at least, the post-merger integration, the PMI, everybody's trying to get the deal done and then start sprinting toward, the reason behind the acquisition. And so, how long of an undertaking, is this?
It's material. So it's dependent on the size, the system, the size of the data within the system, and then where you're trying to take it. I would say that, a lot of times what I would do is I would encourage, and I would run it, but we would basically inventory applications. We'd inventory everything that existed, and we'd say, okay, here's everything we just bought. Where is it going? What are we doing with it? And there were three options, essentially. It was, this app goes to this app. This app goes into an archive. We're not going to do anything with it. We're just going to store the data in case we need it. And then this app, it's done. We'll never need it. It has no value, all that. So we do all that. That process takes, a little bit of time for the team to work through. The actual, gapping, mapping, and then coding all that. There's tools out there to speed it up, but, depending on the system, that can be weeks to months of work just prepping all of that. Yeah. Again, depending on size.
No, sure.
And then the validation, validation's a lot of work. Making sure you did it correctly, because I've met some really great programmers in my life, but they're not perfect. They do make mistakes, and getting people that know the business and know the context of the data that was in there. Cause if let's say I were to do it, I don't know your business. I would make a lot of mistakes and assumptions. You have to then catch those. And then that's probably an equivalent amount of time from the coding and the gapping and mapping and all that kind of stuff. Equivalent amount of time gets spent testing.
Yeah. The funny thing is that you say that, and we see a lot of professional service firms, where their book of business is their contact list. And I take that really, really serious because that's somebody's living. And going back to our train wreck of a merger, it was 6 months later and it's like, hey, that's my client. And, and as it relates to data validation, it's hard to, when you have thousands and thousands of contacts in your database, it's hard to validate. I have to imagine it's really hard to do that, right? Yeah. I mean, I don't understand what data, I understand what data validation is. I don't understand how it gets done.
Yeah. And so some of it you do programmatically, right? So you'd say, I don't know what you said, like let's say your name and address.
Okay.
Ed at this address shows up in this system and in this system. So some of that we try to do programmatically. The problem is, so your quality question you asked earlier, this is where this starts to come in. So let's say, or actually my name's a really good example. So Mike or Michael, maybe I'm a client of both companies. I'm stored different names in each one. Yeah. My address is the same. So the question becomes, is that two different people or is that one person? You start to get into these challenges with, how to actually deal with that. And so it is more complicated than I think people realize. And so you sometimes you have like unique identifiers, like social security number or something like that you might have in some industries, or we call PII, personally identifiable information. The reality is a lot of times with a lot of business, you don't have that. And so you're doing a lot of address matching and name matching and trying to figure out like, do you have common customer records? Can you merge these? Can you not merge these? And you make some decisions. And like you said, like I've seen situations where those have bombed because the decisions we made were wrong. A mailing goes out or a communication goes out, and suddenly customers are calling you saying like, "Why did you send me two different quotes on this thing?
Right.
No. These look like two different numbers." So it's challenging.
100%. And which leads me to my next question of how do you determine whose system is superior? Like, for example, if my target is superior to my system, there's something about, you know what? I'm the guy writing the check. I'm going to force feed you into my system. I mean, is there a way? I mean, I guess the CSpring, do you get into, I'm looking at both systems and this is why it's superior to that?
Yeah, you can do application assessments, and then what I challenge people with is which system do you actually have the ability to migrate into? Are you buying it? So if you're doing the acquisition and part of the acquisition is you want that system, that was part of the deal, and you want to move to it, then I'd say it's part of your strategy. Like, it makes total sense. Move into it. Let's figure out how to do it. If it's not, sometimes what I encourage is, hey, if timeline is really important to you, if you're like, I want this all done in like 2 weeks. I want when legal close happens and I own it, I want this done in 2 weeks. What I generally encourage there is minimize the amount of change possible, which means because the thing people don't think about in that is that's probably definitely possible, right? You can move the other way. Do you have the time to retrain your staff, your back office operations, all that kind of stuff to move from one system to another? Or during an acquisition, do you need to just focus on getting the acquisition done into a completed state? And then you can talk about maybe migrating that new software later or something like that. So I think it's really dependent on the strategy. And I do have strategy conversations with people on that kind of stuff. Is what are you buying for? How important is it to you? And, do you want to spend more money? Because if you're buying a smaller company and maybe they don't have the technical expertise or they don't have the data expertise in house, we've done that. We'll come in and we'll provide that service. But a lot of it's a couple different levers we have to talk through when we do that.
So is it the appropriate time to basically retool data and the handling of data at acquisition, or does that create, what I'm trying to piece together is if I'm a buyer, I buy in, I make no changes. I kind of get my feet under me, figure out where all the moving parts are and where the fires are. But now I suppose I could be running two simultaneous systems. Mm-hmm. How does CSpring, or how do you guys come in and then just say, all right, we're going to dump this together and now we're going to design this the way it should be. Both of your systems are inferior to what 2023 technology can provide you. I mean, I know you guys do that, but how would that look?
Yeah. So let's say you called me, you said, hey, we did this acquisition, or I just did this acquisition. I've got these two CRMs and I need to figure out what to do. You're right. And there's three decisions essentially that happen. So you can stay on your CRM, and we talk about the implications of that. You can move to the new company's CRM. Actually there's four. You can leave them both on their own CRMs, and I'll talk about why that's important in a second. Or you can move to a completely new one, like greenfield it, build your own, whatever. What we'll do is we talk through each one of those, pros and cons, what we're trying to accomplish, business goals, all that kind of stuff. The reason, and you'd say like, well, wait a minute, Mike, you're talking about data, and why would you not want to migrate the data? Because generally I would say always right. Pick one place. The only time I've run into where I would recommend you don't is if you are buying the business and your plan is short term to divest it later, and you're going to sell it again. Sometimes I would make the argument, leave those separate, and we can do on the back end though. There's a technique called a data hub, where we can actually build a way to at least feed information between those systems so that there's some updates occurring. But the other ones, we talk through, what are the opportunities? What do you want to accomplish? What's the cost to accomplish those things? Because sometimes it's a price point thing, and you say, no, I want to do the simplest thing, whatever. But let's say you bought you're on a very antiquated CRM, and the company you bought's on a really antiquated CRM, and part of your plan is we're gonna do some digital transformation. We're gonna make this way more digital. We're gonna automate more things like that. We want to move on to pick one.
Sure.
Salesforce. We have that conversation, and then what we do is we build those models in terms of how we're going to move data. And generally, though, we'll move one system, make sure it all works, and then move the other. And we'll do the one that's the easiest. So sometimes it's the company that you've integrated or you bought. Yep. And you're working on the integration. We'll move them first, make sure it works, and then you move the main company later. So there's a lot of different models, but we do it, and we do a lot of strategy and decision making associated with it.
Do you do any due diligence on the target? Like, for example, I'm a buyer and I'm saying, all right, here's ABC company I'm looking at. Do you guys ever go in and do some preliminary due diligence before on behalf of the buyer to figure out, all right, this is what you're looking at as far as getting it from point A to point B?
We haven't, honestly. I've been on due diligence teams though, and put together plans like that. So it wouldn't be hard for us to do. But what I would actually do, so if you called me and you say, hey, Mike, I'm thinking about buying this company, but I'm buying them for, their customer list and some technology they have and, some of these types of things. Is there any way you could help me understand, like, how complicated is this going to be? We do have that capability. A lot of times what we'll look at, we'll want to get like a little bit of information around them, have a conversation with them. It helps us kind of give you essentially like a maturity level of where they're at as an organization. Mm-hmm. We can then tell you from a complexity perspective what's going to happen. And then we have a high level framework for data quality assessment. I would run that assessment on the data you find critical, not all of it, but a piece of it.
Well, I'll tell you, so many of the businesses that we see, and we've done about 2,200 deals. And I'm telling you that this whole data thing, I mean, this is so low on the totem pole, and it's totally surprising to me that it is. And so I was trying to formulate the appropriate question on, if I'm a seller and I'm trying to prepare. All right. So what data standards and quality control and processes, what am I trying to give to the buyer that makes your, someone like your jobs easier? Or how do I pass that data due diligence? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So like standards and that approach.
Yeah.
So, for us, what I would be looking for is, so I'd be looking for like an inventory of all because you have to think that from a seller perspective, if you can show you have some of this stuff, you might be able to increase your sale point, right? You might be able to say like, I have better customer data. I have more of this. So we look for inventories of data. Like, do you know your applications? Do you know your data sets? All that kind of stuff. And then we look to say, okay, do you have any internal policies or standards, or what processes are you following internally to maintain data, to work with data? It gets a little different too if we start to see things like PII or PHI data. We'll start to ask, do you have controls around that? Like,
what does that mean? What is PHI?
So PII was like personally identifiable information, so social security numbers.
Yeah.
PHI would be healthcare data.
Got it.
And if you're buying a company that has, maybe you're buying a company that has some of that kind of data, we definitely want to know what kind of controls, because usually there's some kind of regulatory component to that. But there are standards out there. There's nothing that I would just grab and say, here's what we have to compare. But that's where I would go grab a regulatory standard and say, okay, you are a healthcare, whatever service provider. You have PHI in your shop. How are you managing that? Because we need to understand that, because there's a lot of value in that. And if there's data issues or things like that, we're going to have a problem. We also then, with a lot of companies, will start to look at, like how they've dealt with data within their environment. What are they doing with it? What's their culture look like? Things like that.
I got it. So who is responsible? I mean, who do you tend to work with on both sides? I mean, are you working with the business owner? I mean, for the people that we serve, and I know you guys are work with some substantially larger companies than, say, that's in our target market, but who do you normally work with to? I understand the check writer, but there's got to be there's got to be somebody that controls the data.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So who are those people?
So we're with all sizes of companies. So smaller, really small companies, few people, stuff like that. It's usually the owner. We're going to work with the owner directly, and they might have a person that they work with that tell us. As the companies go up in size, it actually it's pretty interesting. A lot of times your accounting teams are controlling a lot of that kind of stuff. So if you have, accounting teams actually, they have a lot of the financial data. So a lot of what they're controlling is the movement of if that financial information is going to come out, where it sits. A lot of times it's in your core systems, things like that. If they have a technology team, obviously that's a group we would work with directly. They're usually the gatekeepers of a lot of that kind of stuff. They usually don't know it that well, though.
Yeah.
They usually know what it is and how to get it to you and how to give you access, things like that. But a lot of times, financial teams, IT people, owners in some case, if it's smaller. If it's a larger organization, you start to run into, they have like analytics shops, or they have chief data officers like me that are kind of the gatekeepers of some of that. And then sometimes like operational folks and things like that. But yeah, you're 100% right. It depends on the size and the scale of the organization, and it's different people depending on that. Yeah,
because I look at, a shop like ours. I mean, it's all break fix work. I mean, our database breaks and we go find somebody to fix it, rather than somebody, and the businesses that we see, there doesn't seem to be any, they're more like me than have somebody on staff that kind of, that's the data czar. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And you can do like fractional services with companies too that can become that data czar for you. We do some of that kind of stuff. And sometimes it's not necessary. You do just need to do break fix. And it's a question of, if you're thinking about like getting ready for a sale, you're like, you can do hey, can you come in and just help me with some perspective? So when I do my sale, I'm in a better spot to tell them that, my customer records are good. My information's in a good spot.
Right. And what's prompting this is, we're seeing more and more businesses do quality of earnings reports. All right. And that's that's a low level audit, but the same thing I think goes with the data. And but my point is, I'm really surprised that there's not more emphasis on the data. And I guess I'm curious to know why you think that is, because you've seen so many deals. I'm just curious to know why aren't we, we're looking for customers and customer concentration, but we're not looking at, the data process. We're not looking at, how this business actually works. All we're focused on is revenue and earnings. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And is it accurate, right? That's
right.
You're asking yourself that. Yeah. I dealt with SOX 404 controls a lot, which are essentially that is, how do you know our data, our financials are accurate? And, what's interesting in that process is you really do get down into data processes and not just the financials, but anything that we call it data lineage, anything that moves from, I don't care, a product you sold up into, your income statement.
Yeah.
So a lot of times I think it's really it's an education thing. It's the space, like a lot of people think is a technology space. It's like, it's IT people. They're the ones that work with data. And I built my first BI teams, with accounting people, because accountants already speak data. They just speak it in the financial terms and they speak business. So it's actually a really good model. But I think it's maturity. I think it's education. I think there's just like this conversation that you and I are having, which is amazing. I think people don't have enough of these types of conversations, just talking and saying like, what should I be concerned with? Like, do I need to go learn how to do all this? And it's like, no, you don't need to learn how to do it, but you need to be aware of it. And if you know what's out there and what's possible and how do you build confidence? That's a lot of times the control layers that you're talking about do. How do you build confidence that your financials are accurate? And well, you do that because you make sure your data is accurate and whatever's feeding us.
But as it relates to that, if I'm the business owner, I'm like, okay, there's two schools of thought. Why spend the money before I have to? And because if the buyer's going to scrutinize my data and scrutinize my tech hierarchy and how it all operates, I'm trying to figure out, and that's where the question is it better for the seller to say, I'm going to call CSpring and here's what we're going to do. We're going to figure out, kind of give an overview of what we have. Does that make more sense? Or does it make more sense to say, look, I know I'm getting ready to get, a technological colonoscopy and it's, and that's just the way it works, so which is superior? I like the idea that the seller is providing, this is what I have as opposed to the buyer coming in and elongating the due diligence process.
Yeah, I think that's more, you just hit it. Like if you've got that ready to go, it's just here we go. Like we can start the deal. We can start having the conversation. If you get a buyer though, that becomes, again, it's about trust, really concerned with, hey, your financials, like, where's this data coming from? Like, how did you build it? And you're like, well, I have the system and I just do stuff and I don't know how they enter anything or how anything gets in there. You start to have a confidence problem. And at that point, the question becomes,
right,
how are you going to get confident? And a lot of times, maybe they're doing a financial audit, but at some level, sometimes what they're doing is they're actually doing a data audit. They're looking through that data and how it's getting in there and what's happening and things like that. So, I'm a fan of, I agree. It's actually a price point. It depends on your situation and the type of industry you're in and a lot of different things. But I'm generally a fan of do the stuff up front to help, some people sell their businesses. Do it up front to sell your business. Make it a little easier. You don't have to invest a lot. Maybe just do, an hour or two consulting and just trying to figure out where you're at, what you need to do, what you can clean up, and it just make your sale go a lot faster, a lot cleaner.
I would think so too. So let me ask you, how would you describe the process, what you guys would do? You would come in and how you would evaluate, how you would scope it. And, and certainly I understand fees are based on the scope and breadth of the project. I get that, but can you kind of give an overview of, this is kind of what it would look like for us to do a pre-sale tech audit or data audit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have a model we call the quick start discovery. And essentially there's a part of that that's what we assess. And we come in and we talk about the scope. We talk about, okay, what do you want us to look at? Because a lot of times it's that Pareto principle. 20% of the data is 80% of the value. And you say, that's where I want to spend my time. We scope the engagement, the quick start discovery to look like that. And what we do is we go through and we essentially evaluate all that. We look at the systems, look at processes associated with how data is moving, things like that. We do the same thing if you called me and you say, hey, Mike, I want to do a bunch of transformation work. I want to automate more. Same concept. We have to look at all the same stuff because data drives all these things. And then from there, that gives us kind of a high level kind of write up an assessment on options, which you can decide to do yourself. You can hire us to take the next steps. Or you can just say, all right, I'm good. I'm going to give the buyer this and just tell them here's some stuff you're going to have to clean up.
So as you do that, how confidentiality is so important in the pre-sale part. How do you get around with, hey, why is Mike climbing all over our database? How do you work around that?
So the auditor hat's a really good one. Okay. We used to use that one. We would, you pretend to be an auditor and say, we're auditing systems. We're going to give recommendations on enhancements, things like that. Okay. We can do that. We can just say, we're auditing systems for security, for application, for automation capabilities, things like that. Especially when this is a buyer to seller deal. And it's the owners usually. I've been a part of, public financial companies that are trying to make those decisions. It's called Reg FD and we have to sign. And so whenever I'd work with the company that we're going to acquire, we would do that as auditors. Which if you do enough research and you start to look into why is a CTO of a financial company auditing this other financial company, you can start to do the math. But that's what we would do. We would come in and say, we're thinking about doing some work with you guys. We just have to audit where it's at. So CSpring can do the same thing. We'd say, we're just doing a system audit. We're going to help you with some plans. And that's why the Quick Start Discovery model works pretty well because it can kind of move different directions. Sure. But I totally get the confidentiality. You can't go in and just say, hey, your owner's going to sell the business.
Well, I'm trying to quantify, I'm a value guy. I've always been really, one of the things that our firm prides herself on is, when we say, this is probably what the business is going to sell for, we're pretty accurate. But as I'm talking to you, I'm sitting here going, I'm pretty accurate, but I would love to know how to slice that data piece and say, what, this is the value, when you sell a business, you have your allocation of purchase price and, so much goes to goodwill, and this falls into that bucket. But I'm curious to know how, if you can carve out and say, what, your data is worth this, because we sometimes bump into clients saying, I don't, I'm closing the business. I want to sell my customer list, or I want to sell, my CRM or whatever. I'm curious to know, is there rules of thumb? Is there, how do you do that? If you can do it at all? I'm skeptical to say, that's a hard one.
Data valuation is really hard. If you can direct sell data, there's ways to do that. Like if you have a specific data set you've collected over the years and there's data exchanges and marketplaces where you can direct sell it, it's pretty straightforward. I can give you an estimate. If you're using it from a monetization perspective to enhance processes in your company and like augment sale process, stuff, things like that, it's a little pro forma-ish. And the last one, what gets really hard is the one we're talking about right now, is like when you're selling your business, do you invest in the front of it and say, hey, if I spend $1,000 on some consulting time just to figure out something, am I going to get a 3x return on that? Or am I just going to spend $1,000 and get $1,000 less? It's really difficult. I would say in data heavy industries, you're probably going to get the return. I would too. Like, in industries where my brother owned gyms and he sold them. When I do his valuations and we talk about that kind of stuff, the only data that's valuable is his member list. Right. And he can validate that himself. He doesn't need to hire a consultant to just do a member validation. But if you have a really data heavy industry and that data does have a lot of value, whether it's large customer lists, things like that, knowing how accurate that data is can have some validity and can help your argument when you're negotiating with your buyer. So hard to put a concrete number on it though. Well,
but again, I think the goal of us talking was, that this is often an overlooked area of a sale, and it would behoove you, whether you're on the buy side looking to, understand the data, or you're on the sell side, how do you prepare? This is part of the preparation selling your company. Especially if you have the runway to do it, this is really a great thing to consider. I know we're bumping up on time, so I got two more questions. One, can you, when we initially talked, you had talked about some of your war stories. I'm just curious to know what's the most complicated one you've gotten into?
The most complicated deal that I was probably ever a part of was a federal takeover of a bank in which we found out that we owned the bank. We were going to own the bank. Normally in a normal cycle, you've got about 3 to 6 months of planning and finding out before you have what's legal close, and then you go through integration, and that's, another whatever number of months. We had 3 days. We found out on a Friday night. We had to run the bank on a Monday morning. I don't remember my role back then, but I was essentially in charge of IT. There were no IT people were left at the company. They'd all quit. The sheriffs and the federal regulators had come in, and they'd essentially locked all the people in that building, told them they couldn't leave until there was an investigation going on into the CEO. Sure. So you had a bunch of people that hadn't slept, were incredibly anxious because you have, armed federal guards and sheriffs wandering around this building. I had to bring a team in. And so when we're talking about data, the chief accounting officer needed decisions. She had to make them on Monday. We had to figure out how to get access to all this data. We had to figure out how to maintain all their systems, all this kind of stuff. We essentially had 3 days to do it. It was, I wouldn't even say it was successful, but personally for me, I learned a bunch of lessons on what I need to do from a data perspective, from an architecture perspective, from a strategy perspective. Cause I was used to the 12-month runway, the planning and do it. So that was probably the most complicated one I've ever been a part of, and probably the most stressful, to be honest with you. Well, most stressful from a timeline perspective.
I was going to say, I heard, I saw your lips moving, and all I heard was stress.
Yeah, it was. I lived in the basement of that bank for a while, and it was hearing the stuff we would hear, and trying to find a password to something because all these people had left.
Sure,
was nightmarish. And I actually we built. It was this is early mid 2000s. We built a data warehouse in like 3 days, and we'd never done it that fast before. Usually that's months of planning and work. And I was all excited because by Wednesday I was able to give these reports, show people we could start making rate decisions because there's some things that happen when the Fed takes over. And the only thing that I got told by the executive team at the time was they're like, "Man, we really needed this all on Monday." I was like, "Oh my gosh, we just pulled off a miracle." So I did actually. I put in the architecture and the structures. If the next for that bank anyway, that ever happens again, they have the tooling to go deal with that day one.
Good for you.
So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Last question. I ask this of every single guest. So if you have one piece of advice to give our listeners that would have the most immediate impact on their business, what would it be?
So I'll lean into data because it's what I do.
Yeah. I was hoping you would.
Definitely. It's going to be data. It's going to be data advice. So what I like to tell people is this is the chief data officer in me, is your data is monetized or can be monetized, and realize that. So that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to sell it directly. It means you can use it to create value within your company in some way. So, but to do that, and to create like those tangible outcomes from it, I really tell people you have to treat your data like you would treat your financial assets. What I mean by that is you need to know where it is, you need to know what you're using it for, and you need to know the state it's in. And if you know those things and you're treating it like you treat your money, there's a lot of stuff you can do with it.
Got it. All right, my friend. Well, what's the best way we can connect with you in CSpring?
LinkedIn's a great way to find me. I'm super responsive on LinkedIn, or you can actually just email me at CSpring, which I think we'll have in the show notes.
Yeah, it'll be in the notes. Well, Mike, I've got a minute to spare.
It was great, Ed. You're great. Incredible research. Incredible. It was a lot of fun.
Well, I enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing listener feedback on this because this is a different one. So
this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, likewise. All right, my friend. Well, thanks so much, and I'll see you soon.
All right.
Thank you for joining us today on the How to Sell Your Business podcast. If you want more episodes packed with strategies to help sell your business for the maximum value, visit howtosellabusinesspodcast.com for tips and best practices to make your exit life-changing. Better yet, subscribe now so you never miss future episodes. This program is copyrighted by Myso Inc. All rights reserved.